Good morning, it's Jim Vanderwall with the Fraser Basin Council. Just thanks again for everyone who's joining us for our webinar today on ecosystem restoration with wildfire. Just sharing the results of the first poll to show you who's participating, what region folks are from. Great to see the range of people involved in the webinar today from throughout BC. Looks like the biggest contingent is from the Thompson, Okanagan, and Kootenays, about 37%. Followed by the north at 30%, and Vancouver Island, Sunshine Coast 23%. A few people from the Lower Mainland, Sea to Sky, and Fraser Valley, about 8%, and then we've got a few people from outside of the province as well, which is also nice to see. So, just going to. So if you're just signing in right now, hopefully you can hear and see our presentation. You can use the audio on your computer, or there's also a 1-800 number that you can call into if you prefer. So our webinar today is part of a couple of things. One, it's part of our BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative Series, where we try and support local governments, practitioners, professionals, First Nations, and industry, and others on climate adaptation through training and engagement. We've also got a website called retooling.ca where we've got a variety of resources. We're pleased today to sort of expand our partners that we normally work with and work with the BC Ministry of Forest Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, as well as the Association of BC Forest Professionals. And you'll hear a bit more about where this series on wildfire management came from in a few minutes from Julie Castonguay. If you're interested in hearing about future events, we do have an email list you can subscribe to, and we'll also, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll have it available, a link to our website here, as well as other past webinars that have been uploaded to the YouTube channel. So just a few logistical items here before we jump into things. We keep everyone's audio muted. We've had a great response to this webinar. I think about, at the moment, there's over 300 people attending, and a number of others who've registered and will get their recording. So I think over 500 people. We do encourage you to ask questions, and there's a question box feature that you can be using to do that. That's what we need to do given the size of this group. If you've got any technical difficulties, my colleague Kate Murphy can help you. There's an email there, fraserbasin@gmail.com, where you can use the question feature as well to ask questions or get assistance. And at this point, I think I'm just going to turn things over to Julie Castonguay to say a little bit about the series and introduce Al. Before she does that, just wanted to make everyone aware of the next webinar in the series, which is happening on March 7th on landscape and community scale wildfire risk reduction for Whistler. And we'll include a link in the chat box in your control panel if you're interested in checking that out, or have a look at our website. It's got a description as well of that event. So Julie, do you want to say a few things about the webinar series and introduce Al?
Yeah, thank you very much. Welcome to the first of the new Wildfire Climate Change Winter Spring 2019 webinar series. It's hosted, as Jim mentioned, and supported by the Ministry of Forest Land, Natural Resource Operation and Rural Development, the BC Environment and Climate Change Strategy Ministry, and the Natural Resources Canada, and the Association of BC Forest Professionals, and also the Fraser Basin Council. These webinars are meant to expand on the learnings from the 2018 Kootenay Wildfire Climate Change Conference held here in Nelson. This is where I am right now, last June. This topic included and will continue to include landscape and community scale wildfire risk reduction, climate change, and with example which spans over the province and beyond. I would like to take a few minutes to thank and express my gratitude to a few people who have been crucial in the organization of this webinar series. Many thanks to Kathy Hopkins, and Dave Harnian from the Forest, Land, Natural Resource Operation and Rural Development, and Paul Nuttall from the Association of BC Forest Professional. Also, a very special thanks to Cindy Pierce, who made a personal commitment after the Nelson Conference last June to organize a webinar for the speakers that were not able to attend that conference. Without her perseverance and continued efforts, this webinar series would never have been a reality. So thank you very much, Cindy. A very special thanks as well to Jim Vanderwall, with the Fraser Basin Council, who embraced the webinar series and stepped up the last minute, promptly agreed to provide the much needed webinar technology and marketing. So thank you very much, team. Moving on to our first speaker, Al Neal. He's the Senior Ecosystem Restoration Specialist for the Ministry of Forests, Land, Natural Resource Operation, and Rural Development. Al has been leading the Provincial Ecosystem Restoration Program for over a decade. In addition to his provincial duties in 2015, he was invited to China through the Foreign Experts Program to visit and learn and provide advice on their ecosystem restoration efforts. In 2016, he was temporarily assigned to the Forest Enhancement Society as the first operation manager to assist in building the new society's business design and implementation. During the recent fire season, he supported the BC Wildfire Services in variety of operation roles and incident commander and also as planner and response officer. So I know that Al is very passionate about ecosystem restoration, and you will probably see that through his presentation. Al currently resides in Vermeer, and I'm very thankful that he was able to make himself available and participate to this webinar. Over to you, Al.
Thanks very much, Julie. Boy, Jim and Julie are hard acts to follow. They're so slick and go rolling through. So I'll jump right into it and do my best. Hopefully I'll smooth out as we get going. Thanks everyone, first off, for joining us. And I'm gonna see how to advance these slides. I put quickly this Wildfire Conference that got organized that was held in Nelson, June 26th, in around there, 2018, had a whole number of topics that they were gonna cover. Now, I was actually asked to speak in one of the first action sessions, and it was about what work are we doing on our dry forest ecosystems to manage for climate change resilient, and also manage for wildfire and what changes we are seeing. So unfortunately, I was double booked at the time and wasn't able to make it, and it was unfortunate because it was a great set of speakers throughout all those, and I'm thrilled that they've turned this into a bit of a series that we're going to have and be able to hear some more of these experts that are able to speak to each of these topics. So because of that, though, I did expand my scope a little bit here to take in more about wildfire and set the stage and get our heads back around what we're talking about before I dive right into the dry forest ecosystem management that we're doing. So on that, we'll jump right into it. Actually, I'm going to back up for a second. This is June 26th of last summer. So 1 month later, I find myself over with our experts at BC Wildfire Management Branch. And this is what a lot of people call Fire TV. And it shows dynamically exactly what's going on at any given time in the province. And you can see Haida Gwaii and Vancouver Island hidden under there. But what this is a map of is every orange tab on there is a confirmed fire. It's got a fire number and it's active and going. We've got air tanker requests going, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. We can see helicopter bucketing requests going on. We have active helicopters all over. And our BC Wildfire folks, contractors, and all the support staff are flat out. And that's about 1 month after we held this conference. So I just wanted to show, I think it was pretty timely. As the summer progressed, here we are at Labor Day into September. I've got a little thing I got to move out of the way here. Labor Day in September, the conference was held. I hope people can see. No, I better get a pointer. Having some technical difficulties. My pointer's vanished. Hopefully people can see my arrow here. The conference was held right around in this location, and that's where Nelson was. And you can see the situation at the time. The larger fires are fires of note going on. All of the orange dots show active wildfires happening and red ones with new wildfires. Just outside Nelson, this is a picture that was shared from us by a photographer in that area. Stephanie Heron Photography, and this is the Syringa Fire just outside Castlegar. And you can see that things are going on. Fire is definitely a big part of our landscape, and And our wildfire branch and all of our resources are doing their best to try and adapt and manage within it. Provincially, we saw, as the roll-up as of October 24th anyways, 1.3 million hectares were burned, with 2,097 wildfires that had to be actioned and evaluated and resourced. $4.66 million were spent just on direct fire, and that number may have changed. That's what I had available to me in October. But it was a significant summer, as we've seen a few of them lately. Things weren't much better to the south, and I thought that I would be a bit remiss if I didn't at least touch on it. Just in the Paradise City at the campfire alone, they ended up having 85 fatalities and 11 people still unaccounted for. Property damage alone was 7 to 10 billion is what they're estimating, and that's building structures. That's not talking about disruptions to business, and the direct fire costs of trying to suppress this and action that was taken on it. So that sort of shows where we're at since the conference, and it shows the importance and timeliness of it, of having a discussion about this. Where are we at? Where are we going? And to do that, I think we have to back up and just try and understand a bit of the history of where our ecosystems are at, where our role interacting with those ecosystems, how that occurs, and let's just have a little bit of a discussion about that. So this is actually, I think, a painting that's representing an area in Alberta. I think it's actually Blackfoot. However, it's very representative that Indigenous burning was a very large part of our landscape all across British Columbia, and there's direct evidence of it. There's knowledge keepers out there who are contributing more and more now to our management discussions, and especially helping inform our prescribed burns, and some of those folks helping us carry out burns. It's really a really neat era to be a part of. Lots of folks have probably seen this. So this is a fire-scarred larch tree from the Rocky Mountain Trench. There's some very interesting things on it. So if we go to the pith, right in the middle here, that date is 1600, and it grows out for 400 years. But you can see a number of fire scars, and these are fires of severity that they left a scar on the tree. And of course, the cambium tries to heal itself, so it grows around and leaves a bit of a lobe. And you see that scar, and you can really start to get a historic fire pattern. Now, we're very fortunate to have expertise in our province, people like Glory Daniels, who I believe was present at the conference, or maybe she's one of the future presenters, I don't recall. She runs a tree ring lab out of UBC and has been able to help inform us a lot of our past fire history, as well as research students that she's worked with. When we look at this, we can see a number of fire-scarred trees. The last scar that you probably can't see on your screens is 1907, and it averages a 28-year interval, that on average, every 28 years, there was a fire that came through here. So if we say the last fire is 1907, and this tree is from Canal Flats in the Rocky Mountain Trench, it's about 30 kilometers south of this location. And this picture was taken by a fellow by the name of Herbert Gleason, who is just a landscape photographer in the area at the time. And this is 1 year before the last fire occurred in this part of the landscape. Here it is last year. You can see dramatic change on the land base, and not just in the foreground. I'm going to try and go back and forth on it a couple times. You can see the change in the foreground for sure, but this is also historic bighorn sheep habitat in there, and you can see the changes that have occurred up in that neck of the woods as well. Those open areas and escape cover is largely gone in that area. And this is fairly typical of what we're seeing across the landscape of BC. We've done historic photos and done photo matching, and you can look at it and see these changes occurring through time. Go one more time. So that's the bottom end of Lake Windermere that we're seeing there, and just south of where I'm located right now. Now, if you remember this look of the Rocky Mountain Trench, I think my second last slide is going to be looking north up the trench, and it's I want you to keep this slide in mind as we get there. So let's talk about wildfire a little bit. So 2 years ago, I found myself over sitting in a weather briefing that was being put on out of Southeast Fire Center by a weather specialist there by the name of Ron Lakeman. He always gives us great updates and does a great job there. And he had put up what's called a buildup map of British Columbia, and it was August 1st, and we're kind of seeing where things are at. That's the map on the left. And buildup is a combination of your drought code and your Duff moisture code. And the Duff moisture code, we're talking about the first couple inches of the soil, and it takes a fair amount of time for that to dry out. So it's a bit of an indicator of just how dry is everything getting. And although it talks about the Duff, it's also your medium-sized branches that would also contribute towards the intensity of a fire if you got a fire in that location. Your drought code is even below the Duff. So it's your long-term drying, and it also relates somewhat to how much of your larger stems and trunks of trees going to start contributing to the intensity of this fire as it gets going. So we can start to see across the landscape that the south area is getting pretty hot. The buildup index is 200 plus in a lot of the southern Okanagan over into the Kootenays here. See if my pointer's working now. It is. We can see it started to spread further north here as we get 2 weeks later, August 13th. And we're starting to see this shape. I don't know if this is highlighting or not. I'm starting to see this shape, and I recognize that shape and go, you know, I've seen that before. I think I'm just highlighting now. I got to get my pointer back. Seen that shape before. It was in our natural disturbance type map of British Columbia. So natural disturbance types, as a reminder, people are fairly familiar with it. It's a concept it's been around for a while, but really brought to light into management through the Biodiversity Guidebook years ago. And it talked about natural disturbance types 1 through 5. And the two I'm really talking about, and where our priority is for ecosystem restoration, is natural disturbance type 4. And if we're talking to fire ecologists, fire scientists, they would look at this and say, oh, that's a real coarse fire regime. It is. It's really coarse. However, it really is good as far as making that linkage between fire and our ecosystems. And what it is there's two things that set it apart. It's how frequent does a fire occur, and when it does, what's the severity of that fire? So in our NDT4 ecosystems, we're saying, yeah, it frequently burns, but when it does, it's a stand maintaining fire. It doesn't necessarily burn the whole stand down. It maintains existing attributes, and that's why we ended up with trees that showed the fire scarring and evidence of repeated fire across it. It was being maintained by those frequent fires. Our NDT3, on the other hand, is also frequent. It burns often. However, when it does, it's usually a stand initiating event. So that's one that the whole stand would burn down and you would start growing again. And so you end up seeing large areas of things like lodgepole pine, being a pioneer species coming in on that large scale fire, it has the serotinous cones, it responds quickly, and oftentimes it doesn't go through the full successional pathway. It just gets to a certain age and burns down again, and it starts the cycle over again. So it's not necessarily going through this long successional pathway. So when we were seeing this area turn all red on our buildup index in the south area of the province and through the Rocky Mountain Trench, it made sense. The buildup index is showing, hey, this area is drying out. It wants to burn. And that is exactly the linkage over to natural disturbance types. Yep, it wants to burn, and that's what commonly occurs there. It frequently occurs. And sure enough, it did. So that's where our fires were for the last 2 years. There's the Elephant Hill fire. Whoa, I'm going the wrong way. The Elephant Hill fire we can see, Hansville, Plateau. The orange ones are just the 2018 fires. And again, most times you look, these bottom two are in the NDT4. The top ones are NDT3, and even these are landing in the NDT3. And it's typical. We shouldn't be surprised that that's where they're occurring. So we've looked a bit at historical and the management we took. Now let's have a quick look forward. Now there is some, these are maps from the Kamloops area and a future forest ecosystem work that was done there on climate change. This is 2009, and there is some great mapping coming out, and I'm not using these maps as here's the latest, greatest for that area. They just represent what I'm trying to explain very well, so I wanted to use them. There's some really good work going on and a few different versions of how to do this. So I believe these maps were, I believe they were drafted up as part of the team by Foresight, and it's using a concept, I believe Tong Li Wang and Herman Hamang, I believe it was, that put forward, that it's looking at our BEC zones and using those as a way to represent climate change. It's representing a climate envelope of changes in moisture and changes in temperature. And what BEC zone do we have that most closely represents that? So the one on the left is the current BEC distribution in around Kamloops, Kamloops being right where my pointer is circling right now. And you can see there is a bunch grass zone there. The orange is ponderosa pine. And then we have a dry fir. And as we move further up into the brown, we've got a wetter Douglas fir zone. All these sort of what I would call camouflage colors here all represent interior Douglas fir zones, just to give us an idea of what's going on. The one on the right is projecting 30 years into the future, and it shows what pressures we could exhibit. And to understand what those pressures are, if somebody tells me it's going to change by half a degree, I don't know what that means. But when you represent it by, it's going to feel like a ponderosa pine stand, now I can really understand what they're talking about. So I think it's an excellent way to show this. So we can see the changes that have happened. They're saying a very expanding ponderosa pine zone, very large expanding bunch grass zone, and the dry fir starts extending way up to the north. You can see those changes pretty dramatically on here. Now I know some of the new projections are slightly different than this, but for illustration purposes, this is good. That's 30 years out if we stop emitting carbon today. If we don't, this was the projection. And so it shows the hugely expanded bunch grass zone now, bunch grass all the way up here, and that's in 30 years. Now, I'm not going to be standing on the highway and watching bunch grass go stampeding north past me. That's not how it's going to unfold, but you start to go, okay, that's pressure on the land base. If I stood back and just watched this and we didn't try and manage this in any way, what are those agents of change? What is climate change bringing to us? What does temperature and moisture changes mean? I think it's going to mean invasive species, insects and disease, and I think we're going to see drought conditions, they're going to have plantation failures, and we're going to have high severity fire. And I think we've started experiencing a bunch of those already. Now we have, again, some good folks, and I keep talking about all these specialists that are working on things, and that's what it's going to take, and I'm going to try and summarize that. I hope I remember to come back to it at the end. We have specialists working on climate change adaptation. Each district has been working on climate change adaptation strategies on how to account for this. So the wildfire management strategy in 2010 had said climate change research indicates that the incidence and severity of wildfires will greatly increase over the next several decades. And so that's consistent with that climate change map I was showing you. And I don't think they were wrong. So this statement was made in 2010. And here's a graph. Here's a graph of fire history since 1970. And the columns, the burgundy colored columns, are hectares of wildfire that occurred on our land base in BC since 1970. We can see our last two big years here going up into the 1.3 million hectares. What I did for reference is I put on this yellow line going horizontally across. And for reference, that's approximately the hectares that we harvest in the province in a year. And so I would say, in general terms, if the amount of wildfire area exceeds the amount of hectares that we harvest in a year, that's a bad fire year. And so if I start looking at this from 1970 up to 2000, so 30 years, we had 3 bad fire years. And really, there wasn't any other fire years in there that challenged that amount. This goes up to 2018. 2000 up to 2018, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in basically the last 18 years that have exceeded how much we harvest in a year, and we had another 2 really challenging that line as well. Our wildfire group does a tremendous job managing this, and you know, they're a great outfit to work with. But as you can see, fire is definitely becoming a big part of our landscape. Also on this graph is just looking at some of the history of management that we used to do on that same land base. The green that we're seeing there is silviculture and slash burn area that occurred every year across the province. And also habitat ecosystem burn areas in the yellow. Now there's a little bit showing up in here, but largely it curtailed 1995, 96. It really went away. And there is some teams working hard to figure out how we can have purposeful, safe use of fire in our land base. It's part of the land base, and we have to figure out how to implement it. So I've introduced to you what the Buildup Index is, and this is from 2017 down in Lake Koocanusa Weather Station. There's about 7 years of data that are feeding into this graph. And we can see the gold line is the maximum ever achieved on that graph. The purple is the average Buildup Index, and the blue is the minimum. So 2017 is the red line where it heads off the graph at 400. I'm not sure how high it goes. It might have been up around the bird here, and then came back down once it actually was able to plot. That was a rain event in late September. So it's interesting, when we look at that, remember the 400 index that we hit. This is what's called the Red Book. And it's what our crew leaders and our weather specialists and fire behavior specialists with wildfire use. And it talks about different field types that you're in and the fire intensity that you can expect. So the areas in the red down below here indicate when you get into these indices, which is initial spread index, that's basically your wind and how dry your fine fuels are, versus your buildup index, you'll have a continuous crown fire in this area. In here, you'll be in an intermittent crown fire. Now, if we remember, ponderosa pine and Doug fir is in our NDT4, it should be a stand maintaining fire. Well, our buildup index was at 400. It's off the charts. That's way over here. With any type of initial spread index, we were expecting fire results like this. It's unprecedented. It's stuff that the folks haven't seen before. And it's difficult to predict what the impacts will be on our ecosystems, severity-wise, but it's also difficult to predict the fire behavior. The one interesting thing is that in the C7 fuel type, we would be successful at putting out areas. I'm going to try and get the highlighter going again, and we'll give one more attempt at this. We'll be very successful putting fires out in that zone. Buildup indexes are lower. It's not a crown fire. It's on the ground. We're able to deal with that. So we're successful in removing those fires from the ecosystem. That's where it's naturally occurring. That's supposed to be the stand maintaining fires, but we're taking that out of the ecosystem. When we have buildup indexes in the 400, we're turning a stand maintaining ecosystem into stand replacing fire. We're moving it from NDT4 into NDT3. So NDT4 is tricky. So let's figure out how we manage this. This is our priority in ER. And the reason it's so tricky is we have historic fire patterns, past management where we're doing things differently. We've just talked about a bit of it. But you've also got aspect plays a big role in how your ecosystem looks and will respond. The slope position, what growing site you're on, any forest health that's on site, what species are currently on site, including the understory. And then there's also that whole layer of the cultural, economic, ecological, social values that are layered onto our landscape. And you have to try and manage for a whole number of goods and services that we expect on this landscape. So when folks say, well, I know how we should be managing the NDT4, and I get all kinds of great ideas coming towards me, and I say, okay, yeah, let's hear it. And it's usually about one type. And really what we have to do is back up and look at the whole ecosystem. And it's really complex. We got to be at, not the whole ecosystem, the whole landscape. It's very complex. This is part of our NDT4 landscape. And this is actually pocket grasslands that were a prescribed fire was being put on just outside of Vanderhoof, managed by CERN BC. This would be a treed open range area where we have a very low number of stems, but a really healthy understory underneath of it. It's part of our NDT4. Here's a ponderosa pine stand that actually is a restoration project that we did. You can see a bunch of stems that were cleared out here. A prescribed fire has been put under this stand. It's probably 250 stems per hectare, and it seems to be doing well. This is part of our NDT4. And so is this. We have these thick stands with ingrowth, small stems, advanced regen in it. And this is a whole suite. If I go back, all of these sites are NDT4, and all of them belong within it and are part of the landscape picture that we have to be thinking about. For the civiculturalists out here, I just wanted to put this on and make sure that we had a moment to discuss it. I can't give it a whole bunch of time. The stem on the bottom, I think I have, yeah, the stem on the bottom is an 89-year-old tree that grew in a site with very low site index, but only had 130 stems per hectare. And you can see it actually grew to a pretty decent size. I think that's 24 centimeters across right now. The other three stems are in around 136 years old, grew on something of much better growing site, but had 10,000 stems per hectare. And we can see the impact that site occupancy has on the growth of these trees. So there's a whole discipline around with our civiculturalists of how do we manage these stands, again, for goods and services that we expect, for habitat, for a whole host of things, for fire management, depending where you are. And it is not an easy task. I often get asked, well, this area wants to grow trees. So here's a grassland, and they're saying, yeah, look at the trees are coming in, Al. This stuff wants to grow trees. Why should we be denying that? Well, I agree it wants to grow trees, but I'll give you the counter is it also wants to burn. And it will burn. These areas will burn. So we can either stand back and it's going to happen, or we can purposely do management on this site. We'll talk more about that in a minute. I believe that we are going to do another poll here really quick. Jim?
Yeah, just hold on one sec, we'll get that up. So we're just interested in one thing, which is whether folks who are on the phone or on the webinar today have been involved in an ecosystem restoration project. And just give people a few more seconds here to participate. And thanks very much. I'm just going to close the poll and share the results. So it looks like about half of the folks on the webinar have been involved in ecosystem restoration project. About 35% are saying no, 13 are saying no, they're hoping to in the future, and 1% are saying not sure. I don't know, Al, if you're interested in the other one as well around prescribed fire at this stage, or we can save that for a little later.
Well, we're doing polls and it's open. Why don't we do that one as well right now?
Sure. So just one other question here while we're at it is, are you planning to include prescribed fire in your forestry projects? Yes. I'm not sure how to, maybe. I don't plan forestry projects, or no.
We should have had not a chance as one of the answers, no?
Not a chance. Number 6, sorry. Yeah, you can put that in there. You can type that into the question box if you want, or if you've got some qualitative feedback you want to provide us in the question box. So I'll just share those results as well, which is interesting. So slightly different way of asking this question. So 31% of the people are saying yes, they would, but 38% of the folks who are on the line are saying that they don't plan forestry projects. 9% not sure how to, 13% maybe, 7% no.
Okay, great.
Okay, back to you.
Hopefully we're able to successfully transition back here.
Yeah, we can see your presentation now.
Okay, great. So how we've tackled this on the landscape approach is putting together, in most cases, a steering committee approach. And it originally generated out of the East Kootenays, but now we have some very advanced programs, including one that Fraser Basin Council helps out a lot with up in the Caribou area, and then also the North area through CERN BC. And we had a terrific forester there, John DeGagne, that helped get that off the ground and is delivering an ER program for the North area. So what those groups are doing is bringing together a bunch of expertise on the land base, and it's inside government and outside government, relying on specialists, researchers, silviculturalists, First Nations knowledge keepers if possible, habitat biologists, air quality folks, the wildfire folks, you name it. Putting our heads together and saying, what is good management in this neck of the woods? And trying to prioritize sites. So they start looking at it, trying to prioritize sites, coming up with a desired future condition of where are we moving this landscape and what would it look like? And in some cases, we look at a priority site and say, you know what, we better not mess with it. I think it looks just great. And I wouldn't be so bold as to say, yeah, I'm with the government, I'm here to help. So it's not that every site needs to be treated or needs something to be done with it. But if you have the experts turn their heads to it and say, yeah, here's what we think we should do, I don't think anybody could challenge that. So how it started down in the Kootenays is coming up with a desired future condition map, which is basically, it's not the current condition, it's where we were trying to take that landscape. So if you can see on here, we have open range areas, which are the brown areas. And right now, the categories are defined by stems per hectare. And what we were talking about there was layer 1 stems. And it allowed everybody, whether it was a cattleman, a biologist, a wildfire person, whoever, to be able to understand, okay, so you're talking about 75 trees on this site. There's more accurate ways and different ways to describe stalking. You can get right into uneven age management with inverse J curves and basal area descriptions. And I think that's good, and our prescription writers should have that ability to manage to that. However, from the landscape level, this is what we're trying to do. Having open range, open forest, which is 76 to 400 stems per hectare, and you can see the open forest in the green areas, the lighter green areas throughout here. This isn't the greatest map to zoom in on, so. And then also our managed forest, which is greater than 400 stems per hectare, which really is, we would call it, it's business as usual. It's our richer sites, good growing sites. They're being harvested and replanted as they normally would. The area that we're focusing on, trying to bring back on track and restore those normal fire patterns and ecological patterns to it, is the open range, open forest sites. So we're doing that through things like conventional harvesting, slashing and spacing, and prescribed fire. It's not always all of them. It might be one of those, it might be two of those. Even when you take a stand and you open up and change the stocking on it, you've already dramatically changed its nutrient resources, its light resources, and you're going to get a large response without putting prescribed fire on it. And sometimes it might be managed differently than that. So prescribed fire is a part of it. It's part of what we use, but it's not always. Then we also get into the maintenance piece, that you've done a restoration project on something, and how do we maintain it? How do we keep from all those little soldiers coming in and growing up to be trees? And like I said, it's in the NDT4 and NDT3. It wants to burn frequently. So how do we manage it? And so it might be prescribed fire as part of the management. It could even be grazing pressure that affects it. There's a number of things that could be done to maintain the sites. I better just have a quick look, manage my time a bit. The one thing is we have to monitor our efforts and understand what we're doing. This is a report, and I'm not really presenting the results here. I'm just making the point that what we think looks good sometimes is not what's really good. And we have to rely on the experts to tell us, what questions are we trying to answer? And are we getting the response for the treatments that we're wanting to do? And it's very complex. We've had some very good work done in monitoring throughout the province, up in the Northeast as well. And just last year, I helped sponsor a paper in conjunction with, or a research project in conjunction with FES, that was quarterbacked by Evelyn Hamilton. And she brought in some excellent researchers such as Reg Newman, and they collected data from all over the province and where fire was part of the management schema, and including some wildfire, and where there was monitoring plots available. And they did a bunch of analysis, and that paper came out last March. I will be distributing it through my regular avenues here shortly, but they answered a whole bunch of questions for us on where we're at, including identifying some gaps of where we need to be finding out more on. And I can't emphasize enough, there's a need for collaborative management through this. And that's part of, I think, how we arrived at the roles like Julie is filling right now of integrated investment managers, but it's about bringing all those experts together to figure out your desired future condition. What do we want this landscape to look like? Okay, this picture has me so excited. I'm just about done here, but we got to spend a few minutes on it. So this is a picture of the Island Pond wildfire, and it's just south of Canal Flats. And if you think back to that changing landscape that occurred in one of those first photos, I said, remember what the trench looks like. We can see that look just to the north side of Island Pond here. I better get a highlighter going. I'm going to draw all over this, I think. So there's so much going on in this area. So everything we're seeing is pretty much private land. We had a wildfire occur here in 2017. You can see the high severity burn that occurred here. And it was there was lots going on here. Our incident commander got on site, and there was so much happening at once. There was smoke going across the highway. He had traffic to control. They had to cut a fence line to get in there and start building guard, which let cattle out. So he had cattle and smoke and cars. And then he had air tankers coming in to drop retardant lines. And he had his hands full. And you know what? He did a terrific job of managing it. He also had interface to worry about, and it was quite the piece of work. So let's look at some of the details on it. On the west side of the highway, we can see fire. We're still talking about the fire suppression piece. We can see the orange strip through here, and that's retardant that was laid down by an air tanker. Air tanker groups laid down retardant in an area that had been treated by the private landowner as a treed open grassland, open rangeland here. The retardant was able to hit the ground, and they were able to contain it quickly. It was a stand maintaining fire that was going on. On the other side of the highway, you can see the retardant here lifts right up into the trees, and they had a hard time chasing it down here. There was high severity fire occurring here. Like I said, it's burning under conditions that's turning this to act like an NET3 site. It's a stand replacing fire. It did drop down. It was under burning throughout all of this, but there's a pretty high mortality in all of this area. So let's look at a couple of the other interesting things here. We're talking about our dry forests. And as we move forward with climate change, it's talking about changes in our hydrology, our precipitation. I'm going to try and change back to a pointer here. Island Pond, I took a picture from this location about 5 years before this fire occurred, because I was just shocked that this island, the island that makes Island Pond, it was attached to the shoreline. The pond was drying up. And I thought, man, where are we going with this? Is this what we're going to see in our dry forest ecosystems? Then this logging occurred on a private land. This is an area by another private landowner that's a rancher nearby, and he was opening it up for rangeland. He's going to put cattle on it. This area was opened up. This private land was logged up here. You can see a cut block with some roads in it. So if we look at pond,
okay.
I've got Siri talking to me on the side here. I don't know what was going on there. If we look at Island Pond, you can see that it's not connected to the shoreline anymore. If you remember those buildup indexes I showed you for 2017, it was off the charts. It was at 400. This is as dry as this area has seen in a long time, and yet there's a whole bunch of water in Island Pond right now. And that shows the hydrological effect of managing that landscape around it. Now, interestingly, there's some, I can't find my pointer, there's 2 log cabins located right here that are probably 1920-ish is what I'm guessing. After the fire has occurred, and this fire took off and it went up slope and they had to chase it down, there was an evacuation alert put on. Since that fire has occurred in all this land base, those cabins are now underwater. It's pretty amazing the change that's taking place. Now, the Nature Conservancy of Canada currently owns a bunch of the property in here. They have it on prescription, and there is work going on, ER work going on in that area. And so it's great. They've done good work further up, and I know they're working with some of the BC Wildfire folks already talking about how can we safely and what objectives can we meet by following up our treatments we're doing with prescribed fire. So like I said, there's lots going on in that picture, and I think it's pretty interesting. I took the picture myself as I was flying over the area. In closing, I just want to quote Harold Biswell, a PhD from Berkeley School of Forestry. Fire is as natural in our ecosystems as sunshine and rain. Unfortunately, Dr. Biswell has passed on, but I think that stands as there couldn't be a truer statement, and we're seeing it in spades right now. Thanks everyone for their time.
Great, thank you very much, Al. A great presentation. And I'm just going to do a quick switch here.
I tried to talk long enough so there'd be no time for questions, you see.
Okay, great. I think we do have some time for questions, fortunately, Al. So, and people have been typing questions in here from the beginning. We will do our best to get to your questions. And the first one was just, this may have been addressed already a little bit, but maybe you could just explain we've got a variety of people on the webinar today. Explain the burned index just one more time for folks, or maybe there's a reference we can send around to participants
Sure.
around how that works.
Sure. So a real quick overview of it is there's a number of weather stations and weather techs that provide fire weather information that supports our teams out there trying to manage the wildfires. And what they do is they manage 3 categories of fuels: our fine fuels, I would say our coarser fuels, and then our coarse fuels. So our fine fuels are actually called fine fuels. Our more coarse ones are called our duff moisture, and then our drought code. When we combine drought code and duff moisture code, that makes what's called a buildup index. And basically it tells you how much fuel is available to burn. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, great. Another question here, which is from Kende. He says, I want to use fire, but I need help. Help is really hard to find because of the limitations of training burn bosses. I wonder if you have got any comments on that.
Yeah, absolutely. As we saw, and I showed that prescribed fire really curtailed a lot in the mid-90s, and I was involved with some of the last block burning that was occurring by licensees here, and there was a whole number of challenges, and not the least of which was a liability situation. And the value of timber at the time, and still, is that any escapes were causing damage, and there was a liability and cost coming back on the licensees. And so this is a long answer for a short question, sorry. But we ended up losing both expertise and the willingness at that time. And so you end up with this gap of folks of who is working with fire in a purposeful way enough. And we end up having a real gap. And to build the expertise is not just putting on courses, but actually having mentoring and planning going on, and understanding, and then monitoring and making sure we don't just go and make something black. We're burning it to an exact objective. What are we trying to accomplish? So as I think a lot of our folks, including BC Wildfire and our executive, are understanding the need to incorporate fire as part of our ecosystems, and there is groups currently working on exactly those issues. And it's no different of an issue of if we go back for 10 years and we were chasing pine beetle forever, our field foresters are used to drafting up mountain pine beetle prescriptions. And for the last 10 years, that's all they've been doing. Now you throw them in and, okay, you're gonna do an uneven age management prescription in Doug fir. And it's a knowledge gap, and we've had to, I know people like Ken have helped out, Ken Day have helped out putting on some of the courses for that to bring us back up to speed and say, okay, right, yeah. And I know there is mentoring opportunities between colleagues to figure out how do we purposefully move forward. I'm currently on a working group that is looking at prescribed fire and how do we move the file forward? What is it gonna mean within the province? So sorry, no easy answers, and there's no silver bullets right now.
Question from Kira Hoffman says that First Nations in Northern BC are finding it very difficult to get permission for traditional burning practices. Do you see a change occurring in policy in the future?
Yeah, I sure hope so. And I know in the past, I've been engaged with some of the folks up as far as Fort Nelson and Peace Country there, talking about traditional burning, and I've talked to the biologists there and that sort of thing. Some of some of the guidance that's coming out from the research that Evelyn Hamilton's group had worked on will help support that, as well as bringing in some of that traditional knowledge. And like I say, I think we're all recognizing it, and it does take time for the wheels to get in motion and bring this on track. The one thing I will say is, for our ecosystem restoration, all of my burning currently gets delivered by BC Wildfire Service, and they have some terrific folks that are able to come in, and they're very aware of training needs and mentoring needs and the right qualifications, and you know, they're going to be instrumental in moving that file forward for sure.
Okay. Question from Andre Chalabi. He says, there's research suggesting that the NDT4 is actually larger than what is identified on the BC maps. Is there a plan to restore these ecosystems to its HRV so that these areas can become more resilient to wildfire impact?
Right, so what Andre is referring to there is the historical natural range of variation, and I think both historically, and Andre's one of my very capable prescribed fire burners. I think we can look at it from a couple of perspectives, in that our future forest ecosystems are also predicting an expanding NDT4, and we should be looking at, okay, how do we manage that purposely forward? And you get more informed by the history. Now, if you recall, I talked about the NDT3, NDT4. It's very coarse when you get actually into the fire sciences, and we did have both low and medium severity fire regimes on those adjacent landscapes as well, going right up into the MS, and there is a fire pattern history. Now, I think if we recall back to that picture I showed of the south end of Lake Windermere, that 1906, and there's virtually no forest in the foreground. And I look at that and go, you know, I actually think we can do better. And I don't think that would be my desired future condition. I think we can actually do better than that, and having a better assemblage that'll actually give us what we want as society and what some of our current values are. Thanks for that, Andre.
A question sort of related to following up on that on Rocky Mountain Trench is, there used to be a lot more prescribed burning in the Rocky Mountain Trench than there is now, and there's also a lot of large landowners, private landowners in the region. Is there an option for large landowners, ranchers, to work with government to do prescribed burning on their properties, which often border Crown land?
Yeah, I think that's currently probably out of my scope. There is a prescribed fire group that is working on that, and the devil's on the details on that, and I think that's a work in progress. But I would say that private land really needs to be part of the discussion, and we have some of those conservation properties, like the one I was showing in my picture there, that are definite leaders as far as moving things forward. And I hope that our private land owners, with working in conjunction of these multiple teams, getting informed by our First Nations knowledge keepers, being informed by our wildfire service, or helping even with ignitions down the road. I hope that's a place we can move to. But I don't want to preempt any decisions that my bosses are going to make in that regard.
So question here from Chris Spronkin is, how much not in my backyard resistance do you see to ecosystem restoration work, things like smoke and risk?
Yeah, I know that's a great question, and actually it's a number of years ago, I'm trying to think of the date of that conference, I headed down to Yellowstone, and it was 20 years after the Yellowstone big fire occurred, and there was a conference that we went down to, and it was interesting. The one conference that stuck with me is exactly that question, in that some researchers went around and talked to folks and said, what's your acceptance of this statement? And that we're going to basically describe ER right in your backyard. And the acceptance was like 60%. And then they changed the sentence to say, of course, protecting your home is first and foremost. and ensuring that that's looked after. Now, what is your acceptance of moving those ecosystems to within a natural range and meeting these other objectives? Well, the acceptance went up to 95%. And so I think it comes down to communication and educating folks of what we're trying to do. And we see federal parks, Parks Canada does a great job, puts a lot of effort into their communications. And I think it pays off for them and gives them the social license to operate that way. And I don't think there's actually ever been a better time for us than currently, after the last 2 fire years we've had, that we have the awareness within our communities. They're expecting us, and I'm not just saying us as government, most of the groups I work with are teams inside and outside government. They're expecting us to do something.
Great, and just building on that one, I think we have time. We'll take time for a couple more questions. We're just at 10 o'clock, but we seem to have quite a few people on the line still, so we'll carry on for a couple more minutes, and maybe some of the other questions you can follow up with after. We certainly have many more, and then we're going to be able to actually answer
Okay.
on the webinar today. But do you have any ideas about how we deal with the problem of venting indexes and burn windows preventing us from conducting prescribed fire operations?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. For a number of years, we ran what was called the BC Prescribed Fire Council. And initially, it was really internal to government, trying to have a handle on, nobody really had ownership of prescribed fire per se. There was permitting that was occurring, and there was some folks that would carry it out, but no one was really taking ownership. So what we did is, again, did a collective approach to it, and we had the experts around the table. And for 4 years, I co-chaired it with the Director of Air Quality. And the environment group is very much in tune with what we're trying to accomplish on the land base. They're willing to work with us, but at the same time, as they are learning about our discipline, we have to learn about theirs. And as we move forward, there can be minor tweaks or different tools we can employ, like the blue sky modeling, smoke modeling, where you can see where your smoke's going to go. And it's done by current weather patterns that we have. And so the windows are tough. The windows are tight. We live where a lot of these projects are. But if you think back to last summer, I'm not sure where it was and what it was like in your neighborhood, but most of last summer, we were very, very smoked in. And I guess it's, at some point it becomes, how do we want to take our smoke? And we have to get out ahead of this thing.
Okay, just maybe one more question. Just someone wanted to clarify what you were showing towards the end of your presentation with the cabins on the pond that are underwater now. And was that because the fire removed the trees around it that no longer take up water from the soil, or what's the phenomenon that you believe is responsible for that?
Yeah, so I wish there's a hydrologist that would jump in and help me out here, but it's actually quite interesting in that if we think back to what the conditions were probably like when those cabins were built, they're only 20 years after that initial photo I showed you. And the location of those cabins indicates what the pond would have looked like at that time under those conditions. So I'm saying, yes, it is the uptake of moisture coming in the trees, but also it's the absence of having that healthy understory as well, that grass and soil mat that also regulates the flow of water down towards that. So I think the big thing, and you know, the folks who manage this in timber, the talk equivalent clear-cut areas, but as we look at manipulating the land base, we have to be very aware we're in dry forest ecosystems. By the name, it's built right in, dry. We have to be managing our hydrology as we move forward and make sure that's part of our monitoring.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Al, for your great presentation. And I think a lot of people found it useful and learned something today. Had tons of questions, some of which we've been able to get to, and some that we'll try to get to after this. I also wanted to mention there were some questions about the presentation, so we will make it available, the PowerPoint or a PDF of it, on our website within the next week or so. And there will also be a recording available of the webinar that will be linked to as well. Thanks very much, Al. Thanks, Julie, for your help in getting this organized, and to the various sponsoring organizations. Thank you as well. And stay tuned for our next one coming up on March 7th.
Thanks everyone for joining us.
Okay, have a great day.